get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Lori Marino, and I want to welcome you to the second of our webinars in animal law and science. I am very happy to be here and offer you our webinar. So I'm going to share my screen. I want to tell you that due to unforeseen circumstances, unfortunately, Kathy Hessler will not be able to join us. So I'm sorry about that. Our apologies. But we will do our best, and we'll get started now. So if you have any questions for Kathy or I afterwards, you can feel free to email us. So I'm going to share my screen right now. And hope that you all can see that. So again, welcome to Natural Science 101 for animal attorneys as part of the George Washington Animal Law and Science project that I co-direct with Kathy Hessler, who is the Assistant Dean of the Animal Law Program and the Director of the Animal Legal Education Initiative at George Washington. I am also the president of the Whale Sanctuary Project and director of the Camilla Center for scholarship-based animal advocacy. And the Camilla Center works directly with George Washington University Animal Law Project. So this is part of a series of live webinars that we have had the pleasure of developing with several colleagues. And the purpose of these is really just to introduce the Animal Law and Science Project. These webinars focus on the intersection of law, science, in different realms. And the goal is to introduce lawyers to the impact science can have on law, and scientists to the impact law has on scientists. How can they get involved? And basically, the goal is to create a synergy of animal law and science to energize both of them. In the future, we are going to plan to have more materials available. So just like the first one, this one will be sort of a 30,000-foot basic foundations of natural science for animal lawyers. And we can dig deeper into each of the topics presented in the future. So today, I'm going to see if I can move this. Okay, great. Today, our goals are to familiarize ourselves with some of the basic foundations of science literacy. Help those of you who are in law to know more about the field of science. Talk about how folks in law and advocacy are using science and how to avoid using it incorrectly. We're going to talk very basically about the scientific method. What is it? Why is it relevant? And what is the language and framework of it? And then we're going to talk about how science is useful to animal advocacy, and also talk a little bit about concepts versus consents. In other words, this initial webinar is going to address very large concepts. And we will follow up with webinars and materials dedicated to more specific content. Now, I'd like to ask each of you to make sure that you can post your questions in the Q&A, because we will have time for me to address your questions. So if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A, and we'll look forward to that discussion right after this presentation. So there we go. So an overview of today is to address the questions Why should legal advocates care about science? What is science? What are some relevant scientific concepts? How advocates can use science, and other concerns we might have related to science. So let's start off with the question of why should legal advocates care about science? The law and science have a lot of commonalities, and they also have differences. And it's important to understand both the commonalities and differences. The things that are shared between law and science is critical thinking, critical analysis, and that they are evidence-based. And that's really important because both of them are evidence-based. There are differences. In other words, there are different standards of evidence in law and science, different kinds of processes to come to that evidence. In law, it's more adversarial and result-oriented. Science tends to be more broadly questioning and a little bit slower to make definitive conclusions. And there are different goals. Law, settling questions with as much certainty as possible. Science, an ongoing cycle of questioning, and a reluctance to say things are certain. But the fact is that given these differences and also the commonalities, law and science are extremely important and to each other. And mostly in the animal law realm, where the science of other animals, natural sciences, comes into play in a variety of ways. So why is it important to understand the relationship between law and science? Well, they need and inform each other. Professionals from one group use information from the other, and sometimes they do that incorrectly, on both sides. So it's important that lawyers and scientists know how to talk about evidence. And they each can create limitations on the other. The fact is that good science makes better law. You have better outcomes and a better understanding of the issues. Misunderstandings about science impact legal decision-making. And in the law, they're very difficult to undo. So it's really important to get it right the first time. So let's get into the question of what is science. And again, this is going to be very basic. Science is a systematic method of empirical investigation. Some people think of it as a body of knowledge, but it really is a method. And the method is observation, experimentation, and hypothesis testing. Science is also self-correcting, and no truth is absolute. And it's important, as I've shown here, hopefully you find this funny, science is the method used to get data. It is not something that just puts on a white coat and has test tubes and looks like science. So it can only be recognized by the logic it uses to uncover data. Science is not what you see in that picture. What you see in the picture is science exploitation. And a lot of times you'll see people dressed up in a white coat with test tubes and all the paraphernalia of science. It doesn't mean they're scientists, and it doesn't mean they're doing science. Science is about the systematic method of obtaining information, and it doesn't have to look at all like this. What is natural science? Well, in this webinar, we're focusing on natural science, which is a branch of science that deals with the physical world: biology, chemistry, geology, physics. But it's really important to remember that there's no bright line between natural science and social science being the study of sociology and behavior. I'm a neuroscientist. I study the brain and its function. And that's an area, for instance, that is a natural science, but also goes into the social sciences. So there isn't really a bright line between the two. So I want to talk about strength of experimental evidence, because this is an area where animal advocates and lawyers can really, if they understand it, can really make strong arguments. The strength of scientific conclusions is related to the ability to determine cause and effect. That's called internal validity. It's also related to the extent to which the findings are relevant to real life. That's called external validity. So let's take a look at internal validity. It's the extent to which a research study establishes a cause and effect, a strong cause and effect relationship. And basically, this type of validity depends largely on the study's procedures and how rigorously they are performed. Internal validity is about level of control of the variables in your study in order to make cause and effect types of conclusions. Internal validity also makes it possible to eliminate alternative explanations for a finding. Now, external validity is something different. It's the degree to which research results from a sample can be appropriately applied to the target population. It's concerned with naturalness. So in other words, you can have a very rigorous study that shows cause and effect, but it might have very little to do with the actual real world problem that you're trying to face and address, and therefore it would have strong internal validity and weak external validity. There are lots of threats to internal validity and external validity. Things like experimental bias, confounding variables, selection bias, and sometimes there is actually a trade-off between internal and external validity. So let's talk a little bit about bias and falsifiability, because that is a big issue in science, and it's a huge issue in the law as well. What is bias? Actual bias. It's a systematic error introduced into sampling or testing by selecting or encouraging one outcome over another. And bias can be very deliberate, but it also can be inadvertent. And that's why it can be very difficult to spot, because, bias can creep in to science in all kinds of ways that the scientists performing the study don't even realize. But bias can interfere with the soundness of a scientific study and can occur at any phase of research. One of the important types of bias that's important for law and science is confirmation bias, the tendency to seek out and interpret evidence that are consistent with one's preconceived notions, beliefs, expectations, and desires. So, if we look here on the right, we have facts and evidence that are objectively obtained, and then we have on the right our beliefs. And in between is that there's an overlap. That's evidence we believe. Confirmation bias is just that. It's accepting and throwing out forms of evidence that confirm or disconfirm our preconceived notions. And that's a very, very important and dangerous psychological phenomenon that occurs. Ways to reduce it are to put in place safeguards, preventing bias, using multiple people to analyze, review, and interpret results, using objective measures, and verifying with other sources. So it's really important as a scientist, to make sure that you put in place safeguards against your own confirmation bias that you might not even know about. And that's also important for animal advocates and lawyers to understand where that comes in as well. So with that, I'd like to take a short foray into the interesting world of science versus pseudoscience, because if nothing else, if you're a lawyer, you're going into court, and you're depending upon evidence for making your arguments, you need to understand the difference between science and pseudoscience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the ways we can define or spot science versus pseudoscience. And again, pseudoscience tends to look a lot like science, but that doesn't mean it is. Science uses clear definitions and precise language. Pseudoscience tends to use scientific sounding words, but that doesn't mean they're valid, and it doesn't mean they're scientific. Science is peer-reviewed and welcomes criticism. Pseudoscience is not peer-reviewed and is actually hostile to criticism. So peer review, with all of its faults, is still really important. Science uses consistent and valid logic. Pseudoscience cherry picks evidence, uses anecdotes as evidence, and regularly employs erratic logic. In other words, the logic of pseudoscience switches around depending upon what works or shows the thing that you want to show. So always beware of that. Science promotes critical thinking, humility, open conversation, and always willing to admit when wrong. But pseudoscience has more of a cult-like mentality. It uses conspiracy theories, we're all familiar with those, tribalism, us versus them thinking, in other words, oh, you just don't want us to show this or that. It's very sort of pugilistic, and claims to be the sole source of true knowledge. No scientist will ever claim that. Science follows the scientific method. And that means creating a study that actually can show that you're wrong. Pseudoscience is the opposite. It starts with the conclusion and then works backward to confirm the hypothesis. So that's a lot like confirmation bias. Science changes with new evidence. Pseudoscience tends to be unchanging. It doesn't progress with new incoming information, and it tends to minimize or dismiss conflicting evidence. Science tends to have a way of making claims that are more reserved and tentative. Pseudoscience makes grandiose claims. So if somebody's making really grandiose claims, exaggerated, out of the ordinary, that's a red flag for pseudoscience. And finally, science is falsifiable. It is the ability to be proven wrong, which is considered a key criterion for hypothesis testing. Pseudoscience is unfalsifiable. In other words, it's a theory that is the kind of theory where there's nothing you could do to show that it's not supported. That's not science. So now let's get into one of my favorite topics, statistics. And we're going to get into this very, very at a high level, because obviously this is a very complex science, and there's all kinds of interesting ways you can do statistics. But it is important for animal attorneys, advocates, and others to understand a few things about statistics. First of all, to understand what is statistical significance. What does it mean to say that a finding is significant? And generally, it means you can infer or conclude that the findings are not due to chance. Now, we set up a criterion for that. That's the famous P is less than 0.05. What that means is that we accept by convention that the probability of findings being due to chance are 5 out of 100. So it's not absolute, but we accept that if the chances are less than 5 out of 100, that's a statistically significant finding. Now, some people use that p-value as an all or nothing criterion, others use it as a probability itself. Effect size is also really important because it tells you how strong the effect is, and it's dependent on sample size. So if somebody does a study and they have 10,000 people in that study, that's still a sample of the general population, and even tiny effects can come through as significant. But the question is really, how strong is that effect? And if the more people you sample, the lower the effect size you can get. And at some point you have to say, well, how meaningful is that effect? Replicability is extremely important. You have to ask yourself, when you're proposing something in a court, for instance, have those findings been replicated in another study? And has another study yielded conflicting results? So you don't want to get caught blindsided by citing a study and then someone saying, yeah, but a study done 2 years later showed that study was wrong. So you need to understand the full measure of evidence that you're presenting. And the other one, which is what most people know, is that correlation is not necessarily causation. So an example would be the sun is shining, and it turns out that when the sun is shining, it's warm and people eat a lot of ice cream, but there's also more burglaries. And if you think correlation is causation, then you could infer that ice cream causes burglaries. But of course, that's not the case. So you just have to be able to tease those apart. And most examples are not as obvious as that. Talk about science and truth. Is science truth? Is truth the same in science and law? Now, science cannot reveal the ultimate truth because it represents really just the best evidence at any given time. Scientific ideas are on a continuum from highly speculative and untested to pretty solid but incomplete to really strong and likely not to be revised in major ways. So an example would be the claim that there is ghosts or an independent existence of ghosts. That would be something that's very highly speculative. Quantum entanglement is a phenomenon that's pretty solid, but it's incomplete. And gravity is something that is strong. We have strong evidence for, not likely to be revised in any major way. Objectivity and subjectivity are also really important. Subjectivity relates to personal viewpoints. Objectivity refers to factual data. And this gets to a very interesting issue of whether science itself can be value-free. There's a big controversy now about that. While science is cultural, it's biased, it's not value-free. So is it or is it not? And here are the ways that I think we can look at this. Science is value-free and objective in terms of the rigor of the methods used to obtain data. A good study is a good study, and that will never change. So a study with strong validity, internal validity, external validity is always going to be that way. But science is not value-free in terms of interpretations, applications, ways you choose to use the science. And that's where you take your findings and you decide to apply them in some way. And that's not necessarily neutral. That might be because you want to use those findings to apply to a particular problem. Law is not value-free, as you know. in process, substance, application, or enforcement. So there are some differences there. Let's look at some relevant scientific concepts briefly. These are concepts that are basic to natural science, that are really important to understand the ins and outs of for anyone using science to advocate in the law or in any other way. First is nature versus nurture. The old way of thinking, and when I was a little kid in school, we were taught that the question about anything was, is it nature or is it nurture? In other words, is a behavior determined by genes or by the environment? And now we know that all traits are a combination of both heredity and environment. Some traits, like eye color, are almost entirely influenced by genes, but others, like intelligence or personality, are much more a mixture of genes and learning experiences. Any behavior that you see in an animal, including humans, is a combination of both instinct and learning. Let's talk about the A word, anthropomorphism and anthrodenial. Anthropomorphism is the word that you're not supposed to be anthropomorphic, and it means attributing human characteristics, emotions, and behaviors to animals or other non-human beings, period. Anthropodenial is rejecting the existence of complex and shared behaviors in non-human animals. But it's really important to know that nowadays, anthropomorphism is not really what we used to think it is. It's only anthropomorphism if the other animal does not have that attribute. So if I say that mother elephant is cares for her baby, that's not anthropomorphism. That's a recognition that all mammals experience reproduction in the same way. That is, they have to care for their babies, otherwise they wouldn't be there. So if related species show similar behavior under the same circumstance, you have to use the same terminology because the psychology is probably the same or very similar. And it actually can be unscientific and unparsimonious, meaning unwieldy, to refuse to recognize shared capacities with other animals. There's also something called levels of behavior that's really important, meaning that when somebody talks about behavior in a human or a non-human, they always have to recognize that there are two levels of explanation. Don't confuse them and call out those who do. The two levels are ultimate and proximate. Ultimate explanation is the evolutionary explanation for why a behavior or a trait exists. It's the why. Proximate is how, what the animal experiences that serves the ultimate goal. For example, mothers care for their infants because they have biological and psychological experiences that feel like love to them. What are those experiences? Hormone changes, responses to the facial features and the sounds of the infant, etc. That's true of humans and non-humans. And that the experience of love by mothers for their children is proximate. Of course, there's an ultimate explanation, and that is that mothers who don't experience that don't take care of their dependent offspring and don't get to spread their genes into the next generation. The important thing to remember is this does not mean that complex emotions like love aren't authentic. So don't let anyone just explain animal emotions in ultimate terms, like that lion is ensuring that she's getting her genes into the next generation. No, Well, that's true, but from her perspective, she's caring for her offspring, who she feels love and affection for. And it's really important to recognize that. And some terms like sentience, self-awareness, consciousness, and intelligence are very complex terms that come into play, and it's important to be able to unpack those, although there's lots of overlap. Sentience is the capacity to experience feelings and sensations, to have subjective states like pain and pleasure. Sentient beings can suffer. Consciousness is the state of being awake and aware, period. So if an animal can be made unconscious, then they are normally conscious. Self-awareness is a little bit more sophisticated. It's someone's ability to understand their awareness of their own individuality through time, an autobiographical self, a me. You look in the mirror and you say, oh, that's me. And that is a level of awareness of your independent existence through time. Cognition has to do with the process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and senses. And intelligence, excuse me, is how well you do that, how quickly you process information, how deeply, how much you can analyze at a given time or remember, how you solve problems. So all of these things are related, but they are independent as well. So finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about how lawyers and advocates can use science most effectively, knowing all these things. Well, one of the things is that when you choose scientific experts on your side, you want to choose the best ones. Some are better than others. And it's really important to know that things like credentials are important, but also experience with working with a particular animal is also important. In bringing scientific evidence into the court, peer review always trumps non-peer reviewed, or it should. Be aware that, especially nowadays, there are all kinds of crazy peer-reviewed journals out there that are really just predatory, pay to play. That not all peer-reviewed journals are the same. And some are very highly regarded and rigorous, and others are very much in the category of, as long as you pay charges, you can get in there. And they're called peer review. So it's really important to be aware of the differences. You always want to use the highest level of findings, and that's, again, understanding things like experimentation is better than anecdotes, and other aspects of the hierarchy of evidence. Understanding consensus, language, what bias is, translating science for decision makers. So that's really important. If you come into a courtroom or you're writing legislation, it's really important to take science, which can be very jargony, and put it into terms that people understand that's still true to what that science is showing. And also to be guided by the science in strategy and framing. So that is just a very, very quick overview of some of the issues, just some, that scientists and lawyers need to talk about. And some of the issues that can really empower those of you who are advocates and lawyers for animals. Some of the questions that we're going to be engaged with going forward are things like, what do lawyers need to know about science? Kathy and I want to hear from you as a lawyer, as an advocate. What do you need from science to do your job better? What kinds of changes should occur in different systems and institutions to bring law and science together? What should we study? What types of resources do you want to see that would help you? What types of learning opportunities are available for lawyers and scientists, both in and outside the academy, to empower each other? What types of critical lenses should be incorporated? What are the barriers to effective collaboration among scientists and animal law and policy makers? And what would critical dialogue and analysis look like? And again, what resources would be most helpful? So what we're going to do is, through the Animal Law and Science website, we want to hear from you about things you would like to see, suggestions for additions. We'll be posting these slides and the recording on the Animal Law and Science Project section of the Animal Legal Education Initiative site on GW Law. And we are going to be delving further into the kinds of resources that stem from these very broad webinars that would be helpful and that you tell us are helpful for you to do your work. And our third, I want to let you know about our third webinar, which is coming up in March. The webinar I just presented to you is on natural science and how it can help animal attorneys. The next one will be on social science, which is how human psychology impacts how we think about our strategies and outcomes for animal law efforts, including social science methodologies that can be employed by attorneys and advocates. So we will get into things more into implicit bias, ideas about human exceptionalism, biased language, decision-making, prejudices, groupthink, all the kinds of things that come into play whenever people are involved. And we will hope to equip animal attorneys with what they need to consider when dealing with humans, both in and out of the courtroom, how judges make decisions, what words are triggers for biases, and what concepts are difficult for people to accept. So with that, I want to thank you and turn it over to our Q&A. And I'm going to stop the share and take your questions. So the first question is, it's not really a question, well, it is someone who is asking if all of this is going to be available online. Yes, yes. It's all going to be available online, but the whole webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on YouTube as well as on the GW Animal Law and Science Project website, probably in a few days. So you don't need to remember everything that I presented today. Another question is a very interesting one about sample size. What is a legitimate way to present studies with small sample sizes? Well, you know, sample size is an interesting thing because it could mean that you haven't really sampled the relevant population. And so that has to do with external validity, but also sample size, again, has to do with effect size. So if you have a small sample and you still get a statistically significant results, then that tells you that there is that signal is strong. You kind of have to worry about those studies that have huge samples and then the results or the signal to noise, it squeaks by. then it tells you that what you're dealing with is a significant result, but it's a really, really tiny effect. And how meaningful is that? Another question is, how can one determine if a peer-reviewed journal is truly peer-reviewed or just pay for play? Oh boy, that is really a $6 million question. It's getting worse and worse and worse. So everybody just needs to know that. I think one of the things that you need to look at is the score, the impact score of that journal is, which tells you a little bit about the impact on the literature of studies that are published there. But I would say also, you have to ask scientists, because scientists who are steeped in the process of publishing in different journals will be able to tell you, oh, that journal, you can get anything in there, or that journal's really hard to get into. The scientists know, and they can inform you about which ones are pay to play and which ones are still truly hard to get into in peer review. Another question is, when in March is the next talk happening? We don't know yet, but it'll probably be end of March, and we will, of course, let you know and keep you posted on that as well. We have another statement here from someone who says, our practice is focused on companion animal litigation and is trying to bring the science of dog behavior into the dangerous dog proceedings they're engaged in, defending dogs who are often faced with death, who are being, they may be, quote, euthanized because they may be considered dangerous. Thank you for your statements, Tom, about finding all of this very helpful. This is an area that's very important. Obviously, it's life and death. And it's really important to understand when somebody brings to the table hearsay, anecdote, especially in the dangerous dog area, where there's all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories about different dog breeds, etc., out there that you need to be able to dismantle. And so that's something that's really important, and the science can help you do that. Other questions? Let's see. Anyone else have any other questions, or have I answered everyone's questions satisfactorily? Let's see. I think there's another one. Oh, okay. Can you speak to the precautionary principle and what role that plays in science and law? So the precautionary principle has to do with the fact that you need to be conservative in terms of what you propose. But when it comes to animals, for instance, a lot of people, especially animal advocacy, animal law, and animal welfare, the precautionary principle comes into play when you are thinking about which animals have which capacities and what the relevance is for how they're treated. So for instance, here's an example. Octopuses now, they're invertebrates, they're mollusks, but they also have big brains. And a lot of people find and know that they're very, very intelligent. They're also sentient and they can feel pain. Now, there are some people who would argue that as invertebrates, we don't think that they really can suffer in any way, like psychologically. And the point is that we should employ the precautionary principle, because there is a very real possibility that they do. And we don't want to make the opposite conclusion. The same with insects. Now we're seeing more and more data that show that insects, crustaceans, crabs and lobsters, all kinds of animals who are not vertebrates seem to be capable of sentience and feeling pain and pleasure and therefore suffering. And so when we create policies for how to treat them, it's best to be cautious. It is best to err on the side of precaution and act as though we know that they are sentient, because the opposite is so onerous. Another question is, how about PubMed to discern legit journals? Yes, PubMed is a good source, online source for finding journals. It won't really distinguish between some of the rigorous journals and some of the pay to play, because they're not really distinguishable on the face of it. So you really have to look into the reputation that a particular journal has. Let's see. Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, for all of your questions. Oh, here's another one. Does GWU or anyone else offer the possibility of an attorney talking out a particular problem ahead of a litigation event when the attorney will present issues? That is a very good question. I will defer that to Kathy, but I think that's something that should be done. I think that more of that should be done, in particular in animal law, and bringing in scientists. The earlier you bring in scientists to a law effort or an advocacy effort, the more powerful you will be. So that is just something that you should do as early on as possible. Another question is, may I assume that funding for a study must be disclosed, which may suggest bias in the study? Yes, right. So one of the things you should do, and this is for journals and studies themselves, find out where the funding comes from. That doesn't mean that those authors are necessarily biased, but it's a piece of information. And in particular, there are some journals with special issues that are bought and sold by certain organizations or institutions or systems. And you really have to be cautious about those, because they tend to be pay to play. Not always, and you don't have to jump to that conclusion, but be suspicious. Another example is, could you give an example of a conspiracy theory in this area? There are certainly stereotypes about dangerous breeds of dogs. I mean, when I say conspiracy theory in that area, that's what I mean, is this notion that, you know, there are somehow dogs who are genetically determined to be violent or aggressive. And there's a number of ways to unpack that and to understand the science of that kind of dismantles that argument. Let's see. Well, thank you again. Deborah says very interesting talk, and collaboration with actively listening can create an easier path to resolution. Most certainly the case. I mean, I think one of the things that we are thinking of doing is creating a list of experts in the different areas of science that are willing to help lawyers and advocates and address these questions and empower them in legislation, litigation, policy creation. Any other questions? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Again, I want to thank everyone, GW University, Yingxi Dai for her help putting this together, and especially Kathy Hessler, who was unable to join us, but will in the future. This is a joint project with her, and she's very much a co-director of this particular animal law and science project. If you want to know more, you know where to find us, and I'd be happy to entertain additional questions afterwards, and also recommendations for going forward with this program. Okay. Thank you very, very much, and everyone be well.